You're going to hear tonight has to do with Bill Sackter, or abilities awareness. And our first reader, I believe, is the only one here who actually knew Bill, Ed Gaines. Ed was the person in the coffee shop at the time Bill died in 1983. And everybody's running around saying, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? And you know, people would come in and say, could I just get a cup of coffee? I mean, what is all this going on here? And so Ed was behind the counter at that time, being the guy who held the coffee shop together while everybody tried to figure out what was going to happen. So somewhere after that, Ed can't remember quite when, but somewhere between then and the time I met him, he wrote a poem about Bill Sackter. So I asked him if he would come down and read it. And he's going to come up on our fancy new ramp. Thank you, Terry. Come on up, Ed. You want me to try this? Okay, we'll try this out, see if it works.
Hey. Thank you.
You're welcome. Roll right up here, and very good.
Okay. Be tough and not no hero. Everyone talk about him, how Bill had a wonderful life. To me, Bill Tucker was a national hero. How by he cared
You wrote this.
he took the people with all disability free by talking on the TV and going to the public. He was not afraid anywhere he went. They did not put April to honor him. People with disability of a month. That's right. February, hot of a month. Mother's Day in May, or and Saturdays in June.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, Mary has arrived, and you are next.
About 3 years ago, in January of 2010, my oldest son was assaulted. He was in San Jose, and he has now a brain injury. He's still doing the work you have to do after a brain injury. So I decided that he's a cartoonist, and he draws, and I'm trying to get him to do some drawing about that. And so I started doing some writing about it, and here's one of the experiences we had. Long time after he had the accident. Okay. Bird. It's a question, but it makes no sense because I have just asked Joel if he's ready to order lunch. The nurse informed me as I entered the room that Joel was somewhat agitated and wondered if maybe I should order him some lunch. He might be hungry. She suggested I might help him order. This is Abby, a new nurse on the floor, so she probably doesn't understand that no matter what words he uses, if Joel is agitated, he needs to go to the bathroom. But first I ask the lunch question. He glares and says emphatically, "No, bird." So I ask him if he has to pee. He smiles, relaxes, and says, "Bird." I hand him the plastic urinal and leave the room. On the way out, I tell Abby the problem, and I ask her to check on him in a little bit. She may wonder why I haven't stayed in the room with Joel, but hey, He's 52 and does not need the embarrassment of his mother tending to his toilet needs. Perched on the stools before the tall desks out in the hall, it was the tall desk with computers, are the morning nurses checking on their patients and typing in what, I wonder? Notes on how much each patient eats, urine output, bowel movements, vital signs. Down the hall, earnest young men and women, residents and interns gather. They hold clipboards and listen intently to a doctor for a few minutes before they all squeeze into one of the small patient rooms. A few minutes later, they emerge. The doctor says a few words, and they all nod and write on their clipboards. And then they move on. Don comes along and shouts a big hello at me. "Did you ride your bike?" He then bustles off without waiting for an answer. I shout, "Yes!" And he waves and shouts, "Good for you." Don is in charge. He is the head clerk on the neurology inpatient floor. We have landed there 4 times now, twice for surgery and twice for seizures. This time, it's a seizure. Don knows who to call, the questions to ask, and above all, he is an advocate for patients and families. I'm pretty sure that being an advocate is not on his job description, but it is what he does. He also remembers faces and names. He wears primary colored t-shirts with pockets, and he bikes to work every day, no matter the weather. We bonded the day I came into the area carrying my bicycle helmet. The thing is that through the speech therapy he's had, Joel really has showed improvement. He's made so much progress in his speaking that people actually comment on it. He can speak in full sentences, he makes sense, but now it seems he is without words again. Only this time, it seems more serious and devastatingly discouraging. He bounced back before, but will he this time? He has aphasia with a touch of dysarthria. If you have aphasia, it means you have difficulty finding the words. You know what you want to say, but you just can't get it out. You either block like a stutterer or say the same word over and over and over. The word for today for Joel is bird. The dysarthria, I think I said that right, but affects the muscles involved with speech. Don bustles back. I cannot believe those people in cardiology. I told him that I would see that Joel got down here for his appointment, but no, they don't do that. I mean, he's here, he has the appointment, but what can you do? Sorry, you'll have to make another after he gets released. I grab Don before he flies off to get another crisis. Has Dr. Jansen come by yet? Oh, he's making the rounds in the other hall. Slow today, don't you know? He sighs and trots off. Just then I spot them, another bevy of doctors scuttling down the hall in a tight little group. They stop outside Joel's room for a second, and then in goes Dr. Jansen, followed by earnest young neurologists in training. Excuse me, pardon me, I make my way into the room. I do want to hear what he has to say. Hello, young man, bellows the doctor. Bird? The doctor goes through the routine. Squeeze my finger, push, pull, wiggle this, wiggle that, bend your knee, can you feel this? How about this? Stick out your tongue, smile, follow my finger, look up, look down. How many fingers? Look, whoop. Joel goes through the whole thing. Then he says, I bird, smile. What? Say again. I want push bird. Okay, so I've been through this enough that I know from Joel's manner and gestures what he's asking for. He wants to know when he's going to get out of there, so I interpret. He wants to know when he can leave. The doctor looks concerned. Well, I don't know. Joel starts to object. No, 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 no. The doctor asks if Joel's speech is the same as before. I assure him that Joel was speaking clearly and in complete sentences with just a little hesitation on occasion. Maybe I seem to protest too much, but it is frustrating. I want him to know what he was like before he came into the hospital. Dr. Jansen excuses himself and goes out. Through the door, I see him talking to Abby. Don skips up and joins the conversation. I can't tell what they're saying. I really want them to handle this right. I work on distracting Joel, but he is watching them as well. You know, brain-injured people sometimes have frontal lobe injuries that result in damage to what's called the executive function. That's the brakes we learn to have on extreme reaction, and they don't always work. Joel only reacted with anger in the extreme once since his injury, but unfortunately it was in the hospital a few months earlier after one of the surgeries. They had him in a small triangular room filled with noisy pumping machines from the equipment, noisy pumping sounds from the equipment. There was barely enough room to move around the bed. He was still groggy and unsure of where he was and why. He kept asking if he could leave, and he kept getting out of bed. They finally tied his arm to the bed and called a psychiatrist. By the time the psychiatrist arrived, Joel had figured out how to get his hand out and was standing. Now, Joel's tall, and he was determined to get out of there. For some reason, the psychiatrist stood in the doorway, so Joel tried to get past him and managed to knock the doctor against the door. Moments later, he was being transferred to the psych ward. However, today, the doctor has taken time to size up the situation. He comes back into the room and leads toward Joel and says, with a smile, "Let's get the physical therapist over here. If she says it's okay, you can go home today. Does that work for you?" Joel relaxes, yes. Don gets on the phone to physical therapy. "Hey, send Julie up right away." And because it's Dawn asking, she comes up and runs Joel through the paces and gives him the okay to leave. Right before he moves out, he grins and points across the room at a picture. "Bird?" I look, and indeed, there it is, a painting of an eagle soaring in a cloudless sky. "Like the bird picture," he says. Thank you.
All right, next up we have Jenna.
Hi everyone, we are Alpha Phi Omega and we will be reading 5 essays on Bill's Neighborhood as written by Tom Gilnison. This one is Bill was one of many thousands in state institutions. Bill Sackter spent nearly half a century at a state mental hospital in Minnesota. He was sent there as a 7-year-old child in 1920 and remained there for 44 years. Sackter was a resident of the Faribault State Hospital, a giant institution with roots almost as old as the state of Minnesota. Minnesota became a state in 1858. The very first session of the state legislature authorized the establishment of centers for the training and care of citizens who suffered mental and physical disabilities and for children who were unable to care for themselves. The state asylum opened in 1863. It first was a residence for the deaf, dumb, and blind. In 1879, an experimental program for the idiotic and feeble-minded children was added. 2 years later, this became a permanent program under the name of the School for the Idiots and Imbeciles. Later names for the center included Minnesota Institute for Defectives and the School for the Feeble-Minded. In 1885, another program, the State School for Neglected and Dependent Children, was added. It was located in the nearby community of Owatonna. By the time Bill Sackter arrived in Faribault in 1920, there were hundreds of people living there from all over Minnesota, and the institutions continued to grow during most of Bill's years there. By 1955, there were more than 3,300 students in Faribault. Once sent there, few individuals ever left Faribault. After they died, they were usually buried in a cemetery on the state hospital grounds. Minnesota was not alone in removing individuals with disabilities from mainstream society. Every state in the U.S. had a similar institution, and so did many other countries. These institutions were based on a philosophy that such segregation was a good idea. A historical marker on I-35 in Minnesota explains that Faribault State Hospital was established to provide students with activities and training while protecting them from the slights and rebuffs of the outside world. This marker is located at the Straight River Restaurant between Albert Lea and Cannon Falls. There were always parents and others who doubted the wisdom of separating individuals with disabilities from their families and communities. But it was not until the late 1950s that their voices were loud enough to be heard in the chambers of the legislators and the meeting rooms of the professional societies. By the early 1960s, conventional professional wisdom shifted to support the idea of having individuals with disabilities stay in their communities. Counties stopped sending individuals to state hospitals. Then came a series of decisions to return to communities those who had been institutionalized. Bill Sackter returned to Minneapolis in 1964. At first, he lived in a rooming house near 26th and Bloomington in South Minneapolis. Later, when he got a job working in the kitchen of the restaurant at the MiniCanos Country Club, he lived in a small room there. It was at the country club where he met Bev and Barry Morrow. Bev was a waitress at the restaurant. Hundreds of other men and women left Faribault in the 1960s and returned to Minneapolis and other communities around the state. The same process was repeated in Iowa, South Dakota, and other states. Then in 1998, the same hospital at Faribault was closed for good.
And now we have Katie reading.
This is the second essay in the series, titled Getting a Picture of Bill's Old Neighborhood. Bill Sackter spent his early years in a neighborhood of 19th century wood frame homes just north of downtown Minneapolis. These dwellings were located along dirt streets and were already old when Bill was born in 1913. In fact, they were some of the oldest in that city at that time. Bill grew up above his parents' grocery store on Aldrich Avenue North. His parents had emigrated from Russia to the United States, as had many of their neighbors. And like many of their neighbors, they were also Jewish. Bill's neighborhood was one of the earliest centers of Jewish culture in Minneapolis. It was here that the first synagogues in the city began. It was here, too, that kosher markets and Yiddish theater flourished. And it was here that the tradition of Jewish social services began in Minneapolis. Families in the neighborhood developed their own social welfare system, which was originally financed by a tithe of 10 cents per week. This provided not only aid to the poorest families, but also supported a community center and programs for youth. All of that is gone. In fact, Bill's entire neighborhood is gone, obliterated by successive waves of urban renewal, which began in the 1930s in Minneapolis. But there are some pictures of the Jewish community in North Minneapolis as it was in Bill's childhood days. A few of those used to be on display at the Lincoln Delicatessen, 4100 West Lake Street. Others can be found in the Upper Midwest Jewish Historical Society archives. Part of this collection is online. The rest have moved to the Anderson Research Library at the University of Minnesota. That history is also recalled in 2 stage plays, one titled King of the Kosher Grocers, focused on a Jewish grocer much like Bill's dad, Sam Sackter. The other, Good Evening, It's a City Celebration, focused on the history of North Minneapolis. It includes a scene about Bill which was inspired by a biography of Bill called The Unlikely Celebrity. Written by Tom Waltz, the book was published in 1998, has a few photos including one of the two-story home and store where Bill lived as a child.
Next up, we have Laura.
This essay is called Bill Sackter's Neighborhood was one of many immigrant enclaves in Minneapolis. Bill Sackter's neighborhood of Jewish families was just one of many ethnic enclaves in North Minneapolis near the beginning of the 20th century. If you took a short walk from his home on Aldrich Avenue North, you would have found many other families who had come to this growing city seeking new opportunities. Just a few blocks to the west was one of the earliest African American neighborhoods in the city. It was here in the 1920s that Phyllis Wheatley's Settlement House opened to serve African American families. Social worker Gertrude Brown was the first director there and the first African American to head a settlement home in Minneapolis. A glimpse of her life can be found in a play written by Kim Hines, Lifting as We Climb, African American Women Working for Change. A few blocks to the east was an early Mexican American neighborhood. The story of Mexican Americans coming to North Minneapolis is told in MiniCanos, a play from Mixed Blood Theater. Nearly all of these neighborhoods have been wiped out by successive waves of redevelopment. The latest wave has been obliterated the grid pattern of the streets, so it is nearly impossible to locate the site where the Sackter family store and home once stood.
Now we have Chelsea reading.
Okay, this is called Bill Wouldn't Recognize the Old Neighborhood. Bill Sackter would get lost if he went back to his old neighborhood in North Minneapolis. Everything has changed. Bill, for whom Bill Coffee Shop is named, grew up in a neighborhood very close to downtown Minneapolis. He lived in a 2-story building. Downstairs was his parents' store. Upstairs was the Sackter home. The wood frame building has been gone for a long time, swept away by a city of redevelopment project many years ago. The 19th century buildings were replaced by public housing a long time ago. A few years ago, the public housing was torn down and a new wave of development swept in. But this wave not only took out the buildings, everything including streets was removed. A new neighborhood, composed mostly of 3-story townhomes and apartments, has gone up in its place. There are also some single homes and more are planned. This development covers more than 16 square blocks along the Olson Memorial Highway, called Heritage Park. This is a suburban-style development. For example, Aldrich Avenue North, Bill Street, is no longer an urban avenue, but a curved line which winds its way through the new development. Aldrich intersects with a street named the Gertrude Brown, the first African American woman to head a social service organization in Minneapolis. Brown was the director of Phyllis Wheatley's settlement house from 1924 to 1337. The newest wave of redevelopment was a break for the past in more than just looks. Until now, each wave of redevelopment in the area has resulted in a further concentration of poverty. This wasn't accidental. The city intended it to be that way. From its beginnings, public housing was concentrated in the areas of Minneapolis with the lowest incomes, and when more public housing was built, it was added to the same neighborhoods. This was a pattern which was repeated over and over from the 1930s to the 1960s. Similar patterns of concentrated public housing have been a part of policies in cities all over the U.S. This is one factor in isolation of people by income. But during the 1990s, the city policy in Minneapolis was changed in court. The settlement of the lawsuit against the city includes these provisions: tearing down all the public housing in Bill's old neighborhood and nearby, relocating all the families living in public housing to other areas of the cities and into the suburbs. A pledge from the city that the future public housing would be scattered throughout different neighborhoods instead of concentrating in one area, and building new houses for various income levels in the area, called Sumner-Olson. This new development would become both subsidized housing and market rate housing.
Now we have Maddie and Tess.
Okay, this one's called From MiniCanos to Bill, A Journey with Joe Manjares. That painting, I call it MiniCanos. It was painted by my friend Ray Roybal. It portrays a young man with Mexican-American roots, a Chicano who worked in the fields of southern Minnesota. Put together, Minnesota and Chicano, you get MiniCanos. If you look closely at the painting, you can see a red button on the man's shirt. That button has the letters UFW and a black eagle on it. The letters stand for the United Farm Workers, the union which has done so much to improve the lives of farm workers and so much to raise the consciousness of the rest. Up at the top is a little figure with a grin. That's a nod to the Aztec roots of Mexico. Ray and I met 40 years ago at the University of Minnesota. I guess you could say we were both activists. We marched together for peace and social justice. We participated in several efforts to expand the academic courses of the university, including Afro-American Studies and Chicano Studies. Ray's persistence over several years played a key role in bringing Chicano Studies to Minnesota. After graduation, Ray and I both went on to other things for some years, but in the early 1990s, we started working together again. Ray recruited me to join him and others in the effort to raise awareness about Mexican Independence Day, September 16th. We called this venture El Grito Committee, after Grito de Dolores, the speech which ignited the Mexican Revolution against the Spanish. We worked on a variety of other ventures too. One of my favorites was bringing Ray as an artist in the classroom to the high school where I was teaching. What a delight to have him teaching Chicano art, history, and culture. Day after day, Ray reminded us that here is a long history of Mexican Americans in Minnesota. Chicano families came to Minnesota and other Midwest states, seeking a better life. This history goes back more than a century. If you look, you can find it from Grand Forks, North Dakota, to Albert Lea, Minnesota, from Davenport, Iowa, to Sioux City, Nebraska, and from Silvis, Illinois, to Council Bluffs, Iowa. But it is often hidden, often not in the official histories of these communities.
That brings us back to MiniCanos, which is not only the title of the painting on my living room wall, it is also the title of a play that tells the story of the last century of Mexican-American families coming to the Midwest. Presented by Mixed Blood Theater of Minneapolis, the play has been touring Midwest communities for the past several years. Last week, there were performances in Huron, Aberdeen, and Yankton, South Dakota. The play was written by Joe Manjares, probably best known as the owner of Pepita's restaurant in Minneapolis. This story is based on the 4-generation story of his own family's journey to Minnesota. A lot of history is packed into the less than an hour in this wonderful piece of theater. We learn about Mexican-American farm workers who travel to Grand Forks to pick sugar beets each year. We learn about the deportations of thousands of U.S. citizens of Mexican descent during the 1930s. We learn about the United Farm Workers. And we learn about the struggles of identity both within a family and in broader American life. Minjari is also the author of another play with important multicultural themes. King of the Kosher Grocers is a reminiscence about the grocer in the North Minneapolis neighborhood where he grew up. The grocer in the story could easily have been Bill Sackter's father, who had owned a grocery store in Minneapolis in the early 20th century. Minjaris also knew Bill Sackter, but didn't realize this Bill was of the coffee shop Bill until years later. Minjaris' mother was a good friend with Alice Cameron, owner of the Minneapolis boarding house where Bill first lived in the mid-1960s after his relief from Faribault State Hospital. From time to time, Joe accompanied his mother on visits to see Cameron. Minjaris wrote to me in 2004 to say he just realized that the Bill he knew was the unlikely celebrity of the coffee shop whose life was celebrated in the movie Bill, and Bill on his own. Joe knew Bill during the years when Bill lived at a board and care home in South Minneapolis. This was in the early 1960s, in the years immediately after Bill was released from Faribault State Hospital. This was several years before Bill met Barry and Bev Moreau. Here's what Joe had to say about Bill. I remember Bill very well. I saw the movie Bill and never put the two together until one day it hit me. The Bill I knew and the Bill in the movie were the same. Bill lived with the friend of my mother, Alice Cameron, who ran a home for older men with special needs. The house was located on East 26th Street and Bloomington Avenue. Bill often accompanied Alice when she came to visit my mother. Alice was a little rough around the edges and had a very sarcastic air about her, but I remember how she would step to one side with a smile when Bill would talk. She was very fond of him. The thing I remember most about Bill was his independence. He was always on the go doing things. As I write this note, I wish I could have taken the time to get to know him better. It's a good lesson to remember. Everyone has a story to tell. So there it is, the journey from MiniCanos to Bill Sackter with Joe Minjaris as our tour guide.
I've always kind of been fascinated with the lyrics of songs, especially after you take time and figure out what they really are, since about 90% of the songs out there that we hear, what the verses are and what we think they are entirely different. So this is one that kind of causes me some thought about, and if you kind of just close your eyes and imagine either what Bill's life would have been like if there hadn't been a Bev and Barry Morrow, or what tens of thousands of other people's lives would have been like had they had the chance for a Bev or Barry Morrow. This is by John Prine. It's called Hello in There. We had an apartment in the city. Me and Loretta liked living there. Well, it'd been years since the kid had grown. A life of their own left us alone. John and Linda live in Omaha, and Joe is somewhere on the road. We lost Davy in the Korean War, and I still don't know what for. Don't matter anymore. You know that old trees just grow stronger, and old rivers grow wilder every day. Old people just grow lonesome, waiting for someone to say, hello in there, hello. Me and Loretta, we don't talk much more. She sits and stares through the back door screen, and all the news just repeats itself like some forgotten dream that we'd both seen. Someday I'll go and call up Rudy. We work together at the factory. But what could I say if he asks, what's new? Nothing. What's with you? Nothing much to do. You know that old trees just grow stronger, and old rivers grow wilder every day. Old people just grow lonesome, waiting for someone to say, hello in there, hello. So if you're walking down the street sometime and spot some hollow ancient eyes, please don't just pass them by and stare as if you didn't care. Say hello in there. Hello.
We'll have John come up.
It's hard to top that. That's a great poem. There's a lot in that. So if you're looking for a rope to heaven, instead of going in, look at that person sitting outside and say hello. I knew Bev and Barry, and when I moved to the West Coast in Oregon, they got my apartment. It was a penthouse with a fireplace. If you're a student, that's pretty freaking cool. So this is, I was going through stuff and I couldn't figure out what to pick out, but Wild and Free felt good to me because the spirit of Bill is the spirit inside, and it's to throw off the shackles of any kind of constrainment or containment. Throw that off and keep your spirit free. So, Wild and Free. You say you crashed the moon and jump-started yourself. Did you quash your desires? Did you lose your passions? Did you forget to swoon? What ecstasy is scarcely visible? Do you just stare at the wind looking for that lonely lost lover? Looking for that lover's nest? Are you doing a one-step through life? Looking for that lover's nest? When you mother yourself and comfort yourself when you are dreaming, you are no longer blue. Look at the long-lost lovers list, stacked up and parked out there way past the moon, just waiting to crash this planet. Do you ever wonder why so many folks are trying to get in here? Is there something on this planet that is this precious? Do these folks know something we don't know? Is this a planet of wonder, delight, magic? We'll never know if we follow the certain, predictable, controllable, Monday to Friday, 8 to 5, bankster's path. The controllable, the schedule, the route, the rote, the routine. The beauty way requires that we step off this path. Can we do it? Only the great mystery and we, which makes three, knows with any certainty. There is no guarantee way out here on the beauty way path. Only certainty is you can breathe free, and follow your spirit to a certain way of truth and beauty. Even in the deepest ocean, out here you will be the light. Even in the deepest ocean, out here you will be the light. You might walk alone. You'll find that love comes easily. Love is always right, even in the darkest weather. You will be the light. You'll leave the past behind, always knowing you're right. You'll be the moon on a moonless night. You'll be the stars in heaven, even when they don't shine. You won't be the sun hiding the clouds. You will be the light. The shadow on the land gives you the wisdom that you cannot own the land. Property is theft. The land owns you. And you will soar tonight when many-colored rainbows pass you by. Even if you can't see them, you will dance in ease, wild and free. Passion will set you free. And when that wind comes blowing down your street, catch it and run with it, wild and free. Aho.